Hello everyone, I'm Swadhin. Welcome to my channel. Today I'll be learning Web Development Roadmap 2022. Let's get started. Hello guys, I've divided this video in certain segments to make it more understandable for everyone. Please check below in description for timestamp you are interested in. So before going to roadmap, let's understand what is web development. Web development is the process of creating website which will be accessible to all the user through internet using a browser. What do you mean by that? Whenever you go to a browser and type something on google.com or facebook.com or any other site, there are certain process which gives you this page whatever you are seeing. Okay, let's understand those processes. Okay, so here is a diagram which will help us to understand more. So as you can see, there are certain things which is written as client here. What is client basically? Client is basically a device which is having a browser and it's connected to internet. Means whenever you connect it to internet, you use something called as ISP. ISP are internet service provider. Like in our case, we have, if you're using mobile data or a broadband, those people are providing you internet. Those people are helping us to connect to this internet, right? So when you connect through them, every device will be having a unique address that is called as IP address, right? So each device which is having a browser and also having an internet is called as client. Similarly, on the other side, we have something called server, which is also a device, maybe a computer or a laptop. But the only difference it has is it has some written code there. There are some set of instruction written in this server or device, which is helping us to respond some requests given by all these browsers, right? Means what is special in this? There are certain code written here, and it is listening to all the requests sent by browser and giving them certain response. Like in our case, in this google.com, it will first what it will do when you type google.com, it will convert that into IP address. Okay, and once you have this IP address, right? So this is the address of the server. So like our real address, this IP address is your identification in the internet. So once internet identifies your IP address, it will contact you for the information the people are asking for. Means all this client, whatever information they are asking for, so it will contact you for that. If in here we have the set of instruction to give response to those instruction, it will give a response. If not, it will give an error. So basically, server is also a machine which give response to computers or a browser. And here there are certain set of instruction written to listen to those requests. Okay, so that if your computer or laptop you have those facility, then your computer or laptop can also be a server. Okay, so basically understand that client is also a device, server is also a device. The only difference is in server side we have certain codes which is giving response to the request sent by all the browser. Okay, and there is also something you need to understand. Your browser means where you are able to access internet. It understands few things. One is HTML, which is hypertext markup language. It's a language which is understandable only by browser. And there is something called CSS, which makes your site more beautiful, like how it is in, like if you see this site, the certain navigation here. When I click here, there are certain things here, right? So all this to make it more appealing, we use CSS. And there is something called JavaScript, which will help us to make it more dynamic. Means when I clicked here, there is some menu came here, right? We can do validations. So JavaScript basically to make it more dynamic in the client side. So those are the things only understandable by your browser. So what happens when I said your server gives some response? That response will be in a format of any of these four things: HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and assets. Assets are basically your HTML and the images and videos, right? Though things which is required in HTML to load it, like whenever this is the asset, right? This Google, because it's the image. If you say this is the image, right? So like this, whenever you go to site, that site is returning any assets, that's also will be coming from server. Okay. The few things, client will send the request, server will give the response, and it will give the response in a format of HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and assets, because this is the things which is understandable by your browser. Okay, so the next thing is you can see that we have something called database. And why we need database is basically in your browser, whenever you go to any site, right, it goes through a protocol. There are some certain protocols which makes this request complete, and those protocols, the one protocol which we use is basically HTTP protocol in a browser. Okay, that HTTP protocol are some rules and regulations set by the web community to transfer the data between multiple devices, because we are connected to the internet and we are transferring data between one device to another. There are some rules and regulations set which data can be transferred and how it will be transferred. So those protocols we need to follow to send the request and get the response back. So our HTTP request, HTTP protocol, which we are using to send data in our browser, is stateless. What do you mean by that? Like, it doesn't, every request to a server will be considered as a new. Means it doesn't know what request you have sent before, what request you are sending after. Okay, every request come to a server, it considered as new. So if you don't have any persistent storage like your hard disk where you have data, right? So that you, whenever you come later, you can see that data. Like, so like that, if you don't have any storage which will be storing user data, then it will be very bad user experience for a client. Because whenever, suppose in Facebook, whenever they're logging in, it will ask, it will, all the posts will be deleted next time they're logging in. That will not be a good user experience. So that's why we need something called database. Okay, like I told, in server side we have some set of instructions, some code written to listen to this request and give them response, and to giving them response, it uses database to construct those data. Right, whenever Facebook sends us a timeline page, it have those data like my friend's details and everything there, right? Because it has a database from where it is getting the data. This is the more basic things about internet, how it works. Okay, the next part is very interesting. When we evolved in web technology, there are certain things which came into picture, okay, which made us more because since I told, like, a mobile can be also connected to internet, right? So this mobile can connect to internet using a browser, or we can have the native apps in iOS and Android, right? So what happened, since we are having, previously we had only one logic, and this logic was contacting database and creating HTML, CSS, JavaScript and assets and sending back to the user. So it was very problematic to add a device. They need to, if they want to create a mobile application for the same type of application, what they need to do is they need to create everything from scratch, because there is no there is no loose coupling here. They are very tightly coupled, right? This only can be, it is only sending HTML, and HTML will be not understandable by your APK, right? Your Android or your iOS apps. So for that, what the next thing came into my thing is the called as APIs, right? Application Programming Interface. What is that? What it did is basically it created a contract, okay, between client and server, and instead of sending a HTML back, what we can send now is we can send only the data back. That can be in JSON format, which is a JavaScript format, object format, or in XML format, or any format we want. Okay, basically we can send data back instead of sending HTMLs. That doesn't mean we'll not be sending HTML from server. We will be sending HTML for the initial load or whenever we need it, but mostly whenever a API, where our business logic is there, we can separate that, and that can be used by both your mobile device or your browser. Okay, this is the next step. Why I'm telling you, will understand in a minute, because when I will give you overview of the roadmap, these things will be important there. Okay, so this is about how the internet works. There are many details which you can go further also. I've just given you a basic idea so that we can proceed to our explanation of our roadmap. So without doing any other ado, let's start with our roadmap. So let's start with front end, because that is the most easiest part to start with. And in front end we have 5 segments I have divided into. Okay, the first segment is fundamentals of web, and from which, like how I explained, like we need to understand how the internet works, which I've given a brief overview. We need to go more deeper into that, and then we need to understand the browser. There are certain process browser do before showing you the page, like there are something called painting, creating, rendering, and layout creation. So all this thing you need to understand to become a front-end developer. Okay, and you need to mostly understand how the Chromium engine works, means any JavaScript engine, how it works, because the Google Chrome use Chromium engine. Okay, there is also a separate framework, the back server-side framework created using Chromium engine called Node.js. And then the third and most important thing is understanding the protocols. We have already seen a protocol when I was explaining how the web works, is basically the HTTP protocol. So there are several protocols like TCP IP, there are UDP, there are WebSockets. So all this protocol you need to understand, and what is the need of this protocol and when we need to use what. Okay, that's the first thing we need to start with. Once you get all this thing, then the next thing you need to do is creating HTML pages, because I told you that browser only understand HTML pages, and for that you need to know what is HTML. And in HTML you need to I will suggest like you should go with HTML5, which is the latest one. You don't need to know the earlier HTML. There are some certain tags which is newer in HTML5, and there are some meta tags you need to understand. What are the meta tags? Meta tags are basically, which also comes under HTML5. I've made it separate to give you more importance, because when I started, I never gave importance to this tag. So you need to understand those tags also, because that is important when you go, when you want to become a front-end developer wholly. Okay. So that meta tags are basically tags which describe the web page. Okay, there are viewports and there are many meta tags which is available in HTML5. You need to understand those. So those are the basic things you need to start with, so that you can understand what's your HTML, how the browsers understand your HTML, and how the tree structures are made. All this thing you need to understand here. Okay, once you have basic knowledge about HTML, the next thing is to make your site, the user interface make little better, right? Because when you do, when you have HTML page, right, you will not be having like all this thing is designed, right? It will be not like that. Okay, in case of HTML, it's only HTML. So whatever tag you're using in HTML, that will be only shown in browser. Okay, there will be no style applied to that. There is really no like how it is aligned in right side, how it is in center. Those things will be not there. Means the user interface will be dull without CSS. So for the second thing you need to do is understand CSS. Okay, in CSS there are certain things you need to understand. Okay, the first thing which I didn't mention here, the first thing is called as box model. What is a box model? It's basically when you go to your site, if you know what is developer tool, when you open your developer tools, you can go to, there's something called as here, right, the styles, and there, for every device, like for every element, you have something called as this model. You are seeing, right, this is in a box format, so we call it box model. Basically we have certain margin, certain padding, and this thing you need to understand first. Okay, whatever you are seeing, these are HTML, and whatever you are seeing in the down called as CSS, right? And the first thing you need to understand is what is box model. Once you know that, once you know basic CSS thing, how to write classes, how to use that in HTML, okay, then you need to go a little advanced, which is called as flexbox. Okay, which is very interesting concept, how we can divide our page segment using flexbox, and it's very interesting also. You can use flexbox to do many things in a certain for your entire page, for a segment. Okay, the next thing which is important is CSS grid. Okay, maybe if you are using web development since a long time, maybe you have heard about we have in certain library we have grid system to divide the page into 12 rows, right? And then we can design like how this page is designed, right? This Google page, like this is in certain library we have something called 12 row system. Grid system means we can divide the entire page into 12 rows, and then we can design on the basis of that. So earlier to CSS grid, you need to use a library to do that, but with the use of CSS grid, you can by default now also create that without using any external library. Okay, so that's our concept also you need to understand. There's something called animations, like when I clicked on here, there is some animations comes, right? When I search here, there's some when you go to particular site, there are some animations we see, right? So those animation also we need to understand in CSS. Okay, basic animation. I'm not saying if you are mostly into UI, then you need to go further deeper into that. There is something called as, I've not mentioned the designing part, because if you are a front-end engineer, you need to focus on your designing skills also, because there are certain tools called Figma and Adobe XD in which you design your web page first, then you put it into HTML and CSS. Okay, the next thing is media query. What is media query? Media query is to make your site responsive. That's interesting concept in web development. It's responsive in the sense, when you go to your site, if I reduce the browser size, then also my site should behave accordingly. Okay, if I don't make my site responsive, when I reduce the size of the browser, or I use that same thing in a mobile browser, the site will be looking ugly. So to understand that, we need to learn media query. Once you are familiar with all this thing, then you need to use certain libraries. What is libraries? Okay, if you use all this, by using this all the concept you have learned till now, you can create your own application writing CSS and HTML by your own. Okay, but writing CSS from scratch is a pain, because you need to write everything from scratch. You need to define everything. If you are building a large enterprise level application, you don't have that much time to build it from scratch. So that's why there are certain libraries which already created with the basic functionality which you need. Just you need to plug and play with them. Like that's some famous library I mentioned, Material UI, which is my personal favorite, Bootstrap, and Ant Design, and there is a Tailwind CSS. These are some famous CSS. There are many more. Okay, there are a lot of CSS libraries out there. You can use any one of them. What it will do is it will save your time, and you can focus on the logical business logic part more, instead of focusing on the design, which is basic designs. It will not provide you the entire site, it will just provide you elements. Like suppose you want to use a card element or a carousel, it will have the by default implementation, so that you don't need to focus on that from scratch. Okay, so that's another thing you need to learn in the CSS. The next thing which is very important, because now if you know this language, JavaScript, you can build both front-end language and back-end language. This is the only language in which you can build both front-end and back-end. Okay, so this is another thing. And as I told in the earlier part, that JavaScript we used to make our page dynamic, means when I click this, there is a pop-up which showed me, right? It showed me a pop-up. So how it happened? When I search, there are some search suggestion coming. How it is happening? Those things are done by JavaScript to make my page more dynamic. Okay, and in JavaScript, what you need to do? First thing to understand, because there are some basics of JavaScript you need to understand before going to any framework, because maybe you have heard about many framework which is available in market and which is popular also. The first thing you need to understand is, because I did the same mistake while learning it, I was not focusing on JavaScript and I started with a particular framework. So later, when I was asked basic questions, I was not aware. That's why my understanding was not clear. So what I will suggest you just start with basic JavaScript first. In basic JavaScript, we have certain things like functions, array, closure. There is something called object-oriented programming in JavaScript, asynchronous code in JavaScript, events, objects, scope, and hoisting. There are many more. I have just mentioned the famous one, so that you need to focus on these things because those are the things which will be mostly asked in your interview. Okay. Then once you are familiar with this basic concepts and you know some basic concepts how to write a code in JavaScript, you need to understand something called as advanced Java. There are some advanced concepts you need to focus on. There's something called function currying. There is something called event bubbling and capturing, which is already which is by default present in browser. There is something called debouncing, which will be debouncing and throttling will be helping you to, when you are designing something called a search box and you want to reduce the number of API calls. Those are advanced things you need to understand. Okay. And along with that, there is something called fetch API and event loop. There is something called as event loop, which is asynchronous code operation. We need to understand it, so that many things are linked with this, because Node.js is built on this logic. Okay, so you need to understand fetch API, event loop, throttling, debouncing, all these things concepts thoroughly to understand the next part of your to be a good front-end developer. And the last thing which I mentioned is browser storage device, which is browser storage API. Is basically when you if you go to your developer tools, like I will go to here and I will open the developer tools, and in the tab there is a tab called application tab, and if you go there, you can see there are several things mentioned here. There is a certain part called a storage, right? This storage part is basically your storage API, which you can handle using storage API. This is basically your browser storage, means in here you can store certain amount of data which you can use to load a page next time or same time. You can store something persistently in a client's browser to make it more personalized. Okay, those things also you need to understand. Okay, so once you understand that, so now you know HTML, now you know CSS, and you are familiar with the JavaScript also. Now you can build your application. But if you build your application using JavaScript, CSS, and HTML, okay, that will be, and if you want to build an enterprise level application, you are working in MNC, you want to build an enterprise level application, that is very difficult. Okay, so for that there are certain things which is we use called as frameworks and libraries. Okay, framework is basically some setup rules, some foundation code which is already written by someone. Okay, and those code we can use it, but when we are using those codes from scratch, what we need to follow their certain rules in which we need to develop application. Okay, those are frameworks. In case of library, those are plug and play, means you can use the functionality, you don't need to follow any rules, you can use the functionality what they are providing it. Okay, so like this, there is a concept came into picture called single page application. Like I told earlier, like we have a client and server and we are sending HTML back, and later I showed like we have APIs now, we don't need to send every time HTML back, we can send data also. Okay, with the top of that knowledge, what people created is there is something called single page application, which is basically having one HTML page per application. What do you mean by that? Means we'll be having one HTML page for our application and we'll be updating that HTML page using JavaScript. Okay, so that concept got more popularized because we don't need to reach server to change everything. Because earlier what used to happen, if I need to move to a particular, if I need to do a navigation or something, when I click on this, I need to go, it will redirect to me a different page. It will go to server, get the different page, and then it will redirect me to that page. But now with the help of single page application, we don't need to go to the server regularly. We can use APIs to get our data asynchronously also. Okay, with single page, we have three mostly popular library and framework available in the market. First one is React, which is one of the most used framework in any enterprise level application, or also for projects also, for your personal projects also. And there is something called Angular, which is a framework. React is a library. Okay, so but Angular is a framework, because in React we have some basic functionality to build a single page application. To do more like an enterprise level application, we need to use some other library and packages to do that. Okay, but in case of Angular is a framework, okay, which is given by Google, and React is given by Facebook. Angular is given by Google, and Angular is basically a framework which have all your feature needed. You don't need to install any other. If you need, you can install it, but all the basic functionality, all the things which is needed for your enterprise level application is already provided by Angular. There is other popular language called Vue.js, which is now getting popularized in the market, and then like these three are the most popular JavaScript framework and library available in the market. You need to learn any one of them. Okay, I can make if I want to explain what you need to learn in them, then that will be a separate video, because those are very large frameworks and large libraries. So I will be making a separate video for each later on this. So the next thing we need to go is server-side rendering. As I told, we'll be using single page application, will be less visiting server to get our HTML pages, but that is also having some disadvantage. What is that? We don't have, since we have only one page. So when we create a website, there is something called SEO, search engine optimization. Means when Google search, when you search for certain things in Google, it provides some website details, right, in search result. So how it does it? It crawls every site. Google crawls every website available in the internet. And if you allow them to crawl your site, they will be crawling your site, and they will be storing some information of your site in their database, so that next time someone search about your website in their search engine, they will be redirecting to you. Okay, so those are called SEO, search engine optimization. For those things, single page application is very bad, because since we have only one HTML, we don't have many meta tags. We are not changing on HTML page. So that's why that's very difficult to make it SEO optimized. So that's why what people suggest is we cannot directly remove the server-side rendering app feature. Like from server side, we need to send HTML back, but we can reduce the call using single page application. Means what I'm suggesting is we can have a website which will be combination of single page application and server-side rendering app, which will be the ideal solution for this. So in server-side rendering app, we have certain frameworks in something called as Next.js, which is mostly used with React. Okay, and this helps us to build server-side rendering application. Okay, with React we can use it, and we can have a mix of both, as I told. And so there is something called as Angular Universal for Angular. Okay, there are certain other server-side rendering app also, which I will be going into detail in the later video. Okay, so these are the things you need to learn about JavaScript to understand and create application using JavaScript, CSS, and HTML. Okay, the next thing is, I have segregated. If you see that, like after JavaScript we have something called others. Okay, in that other, some interesting things are there. The first thing which is important is called as bundling. Means when you create JavaScript files, like I told you, when you create a JavaScript will be making our site dynamic. When you create JavaScript files, there are multiple files. Maybe there are 100 files you're creating for your application, but when you send a HTML, you cannot send 100 files from server to a client every time. So what this bundling tool will be doing, it will be bundling and minifying all this JavaScript file into one file, or 3 or 4 file minimum file. Okay, so that's why we need a bundling tool, and we have mostly popular applications like Webpack, Gulp and Grunt, and Browserify to do this operation for us. Okay, we don't need to do it from scratch. These are some library which is already there, which we can use to minify and bundle our assets. Okay, there is again another thing called progressive web app. What is progressive web app in front end? Basically your application to behave more like a desktop application. Means like as I told, only we can access our site using our browser. But if I want a notification when I'm in some other window, not in browser, then I need some feature to enable that. That is basically progressive web app. And when I'm offline also, suppose in offline also I need to do something, like suppose in Instagram a person is trying to post a photo and that they for certain reason the internet is gone, but they have uploaded the thing. If that information is not stored in browser for certain time, now the user need to re-upload the image again, which is a bad user experience. So that's why browser has certain facility to give a website offline capability. Those are called progressive web apps. To make a progressive web app, we have three things mainly. The first thing we need to understand is service workers, which is also a part of browser, which help us to create offline capabilities, and or also something called as manifest, which will be also part of browser, which will giving some basic information about your page. And also we have certain database persistent storage attached to a browser, okay, which we can use to make our offline facility. This is also important thing. Once you learn this will be a little bit advanced in your front end part, okay. And the next thing is compilers. Okay, this compiler basically, as I told, will be using React or Angular, all this framework to build application. But I already told previously that our browser only understands HTML, CSS, JavaScript. It doesn't understand React or everything, right? So we need to anyhow convert this to HTML, CSS, JavaScript when sending back as a response. So that for that we need as all this thing, which is called as compilers. Like we have Babel, which is basically there in React to compile to from ES6, the later framework version of library JavaScript, to the earlier version. We have also ESLint, okay, another compiler which will help us to give like set some rules, which will be helping us to build enterprise level application. Another thing is TypeScript, which is very helpful, which is again created by Microsoft, okay, and that's basically giving a type safe feature, because JavaScript is not type safe. What I mean by type safe means in JavaScript we don't have any integer or string or something like that, okay. We have a general type, means if you're declaring a function with a variable that can be int, that can be string, so that may cause a problem in an enterprise level application since it is not having any type security. So that's why Microsoft developed this TypeScript, which will help us to identify, which will be helping us to design our application in a more user friendly way, or more in a reversed way, okay. So that's where our TypeScript comes into the picture. The next thing is called package manager, which help us to manage, because as I told, we cannot build a application with only one package. We need to use several other library which is already created by other people. If you want to do something from scratch, it will be a very tiring process. So to manage those packages, we need some manager, and that is basically we have npm and one. And my personal favorite is npm, which is a node package manager. And this by using this you can manage your packages, okay. This also you need to understand, okay. The last thing which is you need to understand to be a front-end developer is called Chrome Developer Tool. As I was explaining, I was always going to the developer tools, because that is the important part of your front-end journey. You need to know Chrome Developer Tool or any other browser's developer tool thoroughly, so that you can debug and find issues, or you can create something, or you can find the relevant resources to understand a problem, okay. So this is all about front end. In the next video we'll be going to the backend part, okay. So let's understand that in the next video. Okay, now let's start with backend. In case of backend, I have divided into 4 parts: server-side coding, database, messaging queue system, and others. Let's understand what is server-side coding. In a web diagram, we saw there are some certain setup instruction which is present in server, which help us to listen to all the requests coming for all the browsers, right? And on the basis of requests, we provide them response. Those setup instruction will be creating using this server-side coding, okay? And further also we have divided into 3 parts: server-side rendering app, and REST API and GraphQL API. So server-side rendering app is basically the first way in which I told server will be interacting with database, creating a HTML, and then send it as a response, right? That is the first approach we discussed in an earlier video. The second approach also we discussed about application programming interface, in which we'll be not sending a HTML back every time. We'll be having something called as application programming interface, and that will give us our JSON data or XML data in our front end, in our client side. We can append those data using JavaScript to our HTML. That is the second 2 approach which I'm showing: REST API and GraphQL API. I'll be explaining more about this too in the later video, but for the approach to build all these 3 will be same. So when I explain this, the approach for REST API and GraphQL API will be also same, okay. The next thing is, let's go into server-side rendering app. So to create a server-side rendering app, we need to first choose a language. Okay, so the language which is available in market, there are many languages available for backend development. Mostly populars are C#, Java, JavaScript, Python, PHP. There are also Ruby and Rails. There are many languages. I've just mentioned couple of. Okay, I'll be explaining everything with C# because I'm mostly familiar with C# and JavaScript. Okay, but the same thing available also in Java, Python, PHP. The naming will be different, but the things which I'll be explaining, that functionality will be also there in other programming languages. So when you identify, suppose I'm choosing C# as my language, then what we need to do? In C#, then again we have segregated in several parts. Okay, mostly in front-end part we discuss about what's the framework and libraries, right? Framework is basically we have some set of foundations. Okay, we don't need to build everything from scratch. We can use the foundation, and on top of foundation we can build whatever we want to build, right? So those frameworks also available in C#, Java, and everywhere. Okay, in Python also we have same framework, right? To build it not from scratch. So let's go one by one. So let's understand what are the frameworks available in C# and how it will be relating to the other programming languages. Okay, in C# we have three major frameworks. Okay, there are many more also. I'm just using the three major frameworks. The first one is ASP.NET and the .NET framework. The .NET is the mostly common framework in C#. Okay, like we have in Java also we have a framework, right? So in case of Python we have Django, we have Hibernate in Java, Struct. So all these things are framework, basically some setup foundation code created already, tested by developer, and we can use that to save our time. On top of that we can build something. Okay, so in C# we have something called ASP.NET. What is this ASP.NET? And these are the framework which I am taking, which we will be using to build a web application. There are other frameworks to build Windows application or Android app or other things, but these are the framework which will be helping us to build web application mostly. Okay, so in ASP.NET, okay, again we have several type of frameworks available. Okay, ASP.NET is the main framework. Also with that also we have some additional framework which will be particularly targeting certain way of building web application. The first one is web forms. Okay, so in C# there is something called AXPX pages. Okay, similarly in Java we have JSP pages, right? Or in PHP we have .php files, right? Instead of HTML we get .php files. So what basically it will be doing is the first approach which I showed, right, will be creating a framework in which will be getting data from database, will be doing some business logic, will be rendering that into HTML pages, but that HTML pages will be not in complete HTML, that will be in PHP or the JSP or web page, AXPX page which I mentioned. Okay, and that will be sent back to the client. Okay, so those are basically web forms which were earlier in mid 2000 to 2012 it was popular for web forms. Then again some framework came, the new architecture came, which is a new way of designing application, which is MVC, Model View Controller. Maybe you have heard about those. And this is also we have same thing in Java also. Java also have MVC architecture. MVC is not a framework. I have just mentioned it so that I can explain you more here. So MVC is the architecture which help us to build, okay, the entire architecture more loosely coupled. Okay, so in case of web forms, our code behind means our logic code and the HTML code was tightly coupled in one page. Okay, so in MVC architecture we are able to segregate it. Okay, the UI to the controller, everything we are able to segregate it. There are other frameworks also like entity framework. These entity framework on ADO.NET are basically called as ORM. Okay, object relational mapper. There is something called object document mapper also. Okay, those frameworks are basically to interact with a database. Okay, particular database. Similarly, in case of Java we have Hibernate. Okay, in case of Python also we have. So this basically those frameworks help us to connect to a database. Okay, and make our life much easier. Okay, we can directly connect also, but it's basically to allow models, the classes, to use a database table. This framework will help us thus. Similarly, all these frameworks are available in all the languages I'm mentioning. Okay, the last one is ASP.NET Web API. Basically, this is the second part of architecture which we explained, creating a REST API and having a separate server code. And this API will be contacting database, not the server directly. And this API will return data, not HTML page. Okay, that's basically that ASP.NET Web API which we have a REST API, right? That will be created using this ASP.NET Web API framework. Okay, similarly in Java also we have web APIs. Similarly in Python, PHP, every language have their own way of creating web API. Okay, this is the first thing. And this is about ASP.NET. And recently in C#, C# language, there is another framework came into picture, and that's like ASP.NET Core. And what is basically the same way, and we have also their new ORM and new way. The problem with ASP.NET earlier was it was not open sourced. Okay, so that's why there was many problem with this framework. So now they have Microsoft team, they have created a now open source framework which is very lightweight. And we in case of ASP.NET, we always used to host that in IIS, which is provided by Microsoft. So that's why we didn't have any decoupled functionality, right? They are very tightly coupled. Okay, that's why Microsoft created another framework called ASP.NET Core, which is very lightweight, and also we can host it in any platform we want. It's the cross operating system also. So that's why this provides the same feature. We have a web API, we have also server-side rendering app with ASP.NET Core. We can create REST API, we also have a ORM here, right? The same thing. So and other type of services which we also create is WCF. Before REST API, there was something called WCF, which was very popular in the market, which is basically Windows Communication Foundation. What is that? Basically, we used to transfer, instead of transferring data with JSON or JSON, we used to follow something called as XML. We used to transfer data with the help of XML. Okay, and those things will be created. For those things, we used to have WCF. Okay, we will be having different endpoints, and with that we can connect to multiple clients and we can send data in multiple formats. Okay, so that was earlier. Now also we use WCF. There are certain applications we use WCF. There is the requirement. It's always depends upon your requirement, but that is another way of doing creating web application or web services. Okay, the next thing which is there in C#, we can say this is all about frameworks and thing, and there is also about libraries. Okay, libraries are basically some additional plug and play thing. Means in case of framework, you need to follow their rule to develop your application. You cannot do what is restricted in the framework. But in case of library, that's basically reusable functions you're using to do your application. You don't need to follow anything to do in a certain way, but you are just using their functionality to reduce your code, right? So there are two mostly popular library in C#. That's called a SignalR and Identity. And why I'm explaining these are framework is basically because this name may be different in other languages. Okay, but this is a common feature we should know as a web developer to build application. What is the SignalR? SignalR basically WebSockets. Okay, this basically a library which help us to create WebSocket communication. What is WebSocket communication? That's basically dual communications. Means whenever you are messaging with someone, whenever they are typing, you are able to know that when they are sending message, you are immediately getting the message, right? And if you do build this kind of application using a server client relationship, then it will be very hard for to send and to manage when you scale it. So that's why we have something called WebSocket, where once you open a connection, till you close it, you can transfer data between the devices. Okay, so that for those kind of scenario we use WebSockets. And in case of Microsoft or in case of .NET, we have SignalR to do all this thing for us. Okay, similarly in Node.js we have WebSockets. In Java also we have WebSocket communications. So all this thing will be available with other languages also. So you need to know why I'm teaching you basically this is you need to learn this basic functionality. What is WebSockets? And in your language you need to find out what is that WebSocket and how we can implement that. The another thing is identity. And that's very important part of any application, that is authentication. Okay, there is two terms called authentication and authorization. Means who are authorized to view our application. Means when we log in, we are authenticating, we are a valid user, right? When you give username and password in a particular site. And there is something called authorization also, how much we have the access. Okay, so those things also we have certain library in which we can manage it. In other languages also we have certain language in which we can manage it. Okay, so for that we have identity in C#. We have several other libraries in Java and Python also. Okay, similarly, another third important thing which we need in web applications is package manager. As in front-end, we saw that whenever we build application, we don't write everything from scratch. Similarly, in backend also, we don't write everything from scratch. We use certain frameworks or certain library which is already created by the developers. So those package we can manage using, there is something called as package manager. In C# we have NuGet manager, in Java we have Maven, right? All these things help us to manage our packages. So all these languages have their own packages. So in case of Python, you can learn Django, right? All these are frameworks and library you should be knowing to create a web application. Every language have their own web application framework, and all these concepts which I explained, that will be also there in other languages also. Similarly, in JavaScript, like in Node.js, we have all this, we have Express frameworks, we have Mongoose to connect to a database, that's basically ODM, okay? We have Meteor.js, we have Socket.io to do WebSocket, which is we are doing in SignalR with C#, and we have server-side rendering app, Next.js we have, right? So all these things, some frameworks available in Node.js, okay? So now, since you understand all this thing, right? What is, and for REST API also, we'll need to do the same thing, okay? For REST API also, we have to create, like we need to pick a language, then we need to choose a framework. In case of us, ASP.NET Web API or ASP.NET Core Web API, the language or framework is depends on the whatever you're choosing it, but the procedure will be same, okay? So this is about server-side rendering app. Let's go to the next part, which is important. Again, that's called database. Okay, and this is for our persistent storage. And in our database, I have divided into two parts. The first part is SQL database, which is basically structured query language. Means we need some relational database, because when we store some data related to user, where we have a relation, means when I'm going to Amazon, I'm ordering some item, so that order belongs to me, so that we have a relation. So in those kind of scenario, we can use SQL databases. When we don't have a relation, okay, there is a new database which we are now using, and depends on the scenario we are using, that's called a NoSQL database basically. And in NoSQL database, we don't have any structure, we don't have any relationship, okay, but also we can have a relationship using a framework called Mongoose or something like that. We can create, but that will be from code side. From database itself, we cannot create any relationship. Okay, so since that's why I have divided into two parts, SQL and NoSQL. The SQL databases you can learn is one is SQL Server, which is one of the popular database, PostgreSQL, MySQL, Oracle. These are some of the most popular SQL databases available in the market. There are many cloud databases which is now available in the market. I have just explained the basic one to start with. Okay, you can go with because those cloud AWS or Azure databases of SQL are extension of this language, this databases only. Okay, then we have in NoSQL, we have three type of database. The first one is document-based database, where we in NoSQL we store data in JSON format or key value format or in a tabular format. So basically, when we want to store in a document format, object format, we use document-based database that we have MongoDB or CouchDB to create that. Okay, and we can use something called as Mongoose frameworks to create with a connected application or any MongoDB driver with .NET or Java anywhere. Okay, similarly, we have something called key value stores, that's Memcached and Redis. Okay, the important part about Memcached and Redis, why this two database is important is, this is, as I told in my earlier lecture, that we need a database to persist our data, right? But when you build an application, later stage, you need to also cache it. Why we need caching? Because every time if you're requesting data to your database, then it will be loaded with multiple requests. So that's why we have something called as caching mechanism, which as a developer you should know, which will be helping us to reduce load on database. Means if that data is present in cache, we can give the data from cache without going to the database itself. Okay, so that is, and cache is basically they use this Memcached and Redis. They are created using some separate modules in laptop or devices, which stores our data very fast, which retrieve and stores our data very fast, so that we can use for that. Okay, Memcached and Redis, and those two are database used mostly for caching only. Okay, and then also we have some tabular data like HBase, Bigtable, and Cassandra, and these are basically the data. And suppose you have a data warehouse, you have more data like Amazon or big companies, right? In that case, you don't need all the data to be, you are not interacting with all the data always. You have some data which will be there in a history format, right? You don't need every data to be usable, because suppose your orders in Amazon, you don't see your old orders frequently, right? So those data, the large amount of data can be stored in this tabular format database, so that it will be stored in a key value, it will be stored in a tabular format. Okay, and it will be very easy to, and Cassandra, Bigtable and HBase is very easy to scale. Okay, and that's why we have this kind of database. That also we need to learn. to have, when your data requirement is more, when you want to store large level application data, then we will be going for tabular. And there are some limitation with all this approach. Means generally when we have mostly write operation, we go for SQL. When we are more towards read operation, then we go for MongoDB or any document DB database. When you have data like that history data, which we don't use that much frequently, we just do read operation. In that case, we can go for any tabular format. But again, this scenario is based on your requirement and all this thing you need to consider. That's a general view I'm giving to you. Okay, once you understand database, then the next thing will be the messaging queue system. Why we need messaging queue system? Since the application has been evolved, right? Now there is two terms which were mostly popularized earlier. There is something called as monolithic application. When we have single application like this, okay, we have only one API, one server, site code, one database, then what will happen when any of this code will fail, then the entire application will fail. Okay, we don't have any failure, we don't have anything which, if any of the, suppose our database connection is lost, then we will be facing lots of issue giving response to our user. Okay, so that's where when the time evolved, we came up with an approach called microservice architecture. And for that, we need to know any one of this queuing system to understand microservice. Okay, and understand why we need microservice. That's a separate discussion. We cannot go into that. But to create a microservice application, we need something called event-based messaging queuing system, in which we'll be sending some message and we can notify multiple servers running in a backend server. Okay, and that's why we have some popular queuing system I mentioned: RabbitMQ, Kafka, Nuts. Kafka is my favorite among them. So anyone you can learn from them. And in case of others, I have mentioned about some essential things as a web developer, as a backend developer, you should be knowing any language. You are in C#, Java, or any language, you should be knowing all this thing. That's Elasticsearch. It makes it's again a database. Okay, I should have mentioned in databases, but it's not a simple database. Basically a search engine. Okay, a text-based search engine, which will be helping us to create search functionality faster. You don't need to do from scratch. You just need to use this package and their indexing functionality. Okay, and that's very usable, and it's very scalable also. Okay, and it's also a data store, but we generally don't prefer Elasticsearch as our primary data store. Okay, but we should be having some knowledge on this one. There's something called Kibana, which is again comes with Elasticsearch, which help us to visualize our logs, which are our data we are searching it, right? We can visualize that using Kibana. And Prometheus, again, that's also a monitoring system. This Kibana and Prometheus is a monitoring system which will help your application to track, or other people can track it. And as a developer also, you can track all this thing. Okay, you can create a graphical representation of your application, the searches, all the data used. Okay, and again, the most important part in application is logging. Okay, when you are creating an application, you should be having proper logs to find out the root cause if something failed. Okay, so that's the part about backend. Let's move on to the next part, which is basically our DevOps. In DevOps, I have divided into three parts: container system, CI/CD, and server deployment. So now your front end is ready. Now the backend is also developed. It is working in your local development machine. We need to move this code to somewhere so that everyone can access it. There comes the DevOps part. Okay. So now to move a code to make it available to everyone, we need to do, there are three processes we can do. The first one is manual deployment, right? Like server deployment, which I mentioned, means that already there are some servers which is available in market. There we can deploy our application so that in that machine, they will be listening to all the requests coming for that port or the IP, and they will be redirecting it accordingly. Okay. So those servers are basically IIS server, Apache server, LightPD web server, Node.js web servers, and Java system servers. So these are basically some server. There are many more in the market. I've just mentioned the famous ones. Okay, so these are the server in which we can deploy our applications. Okay, and similarly, once this is a manual deployment, but what will happen? Say suppose I have deployed my application to any of the one server, and now I did some bug fix. I did some code change. So what I need to do now? Again, if we are doing manual deployment, then again we need to deploy it into the server. Okay, we need to repeat the process whenever we are changing the code. So to solve this problem, they came up with an idea called continuous deployment, continuous integration. Okay, that's called CI/CD. What is CI/CD? Basically, we will be writing one-time configuration, adding it to our project. That configuration will help us whenever we are checking in a new code in our source control, maybe GitHub or SVN, whatever source control you are using. That time we will be triggering some pipelines which will help our code move from development machine to the machine in which we want to host it. Okay, so those CI/CD will be helping us to, without doing manually deploying it, it will help us to do it when we can set some rules. On the basis of that, it can deploy our application. Okay, so that will help us in our development process. And again, that's also, we have something called as some reporting also we can do, but that will be extra part, so that we don't need to create. But any one of this will be fine for, we don't need to learn everything, right? Any one of this tool will be fine for creating CI/CD application. Okay, but Travis CI is only Travis CI, continuous integration tool. It's not a continuous deployment tool. So apart from that, everything other is basically a continuous integration and development tool. You can use any one of them. Okay, what is continuous? Basically, it allows us to do virtualization in our OS. Okay, in which we can isolate our bundle, our configuration together. Okay, so that will help us to develop faster. Means every configuration we just need to build once, and once we create an image, Docker image, that image can be transferred anywhere, and we can start the code from there. We can run it from there. Okay, that's a very interesting concept. We can use a operating system to make multiple container and behave as the different devices. Okay, that's very and a very important part of today's development. When you are mostly building microservice architecture, we need Docker, okay, to separate our multiple services, multiple business logic, and the configuration. And Kubernetes is basically extension of Docker, because with the help of Kubernetes we can use multi-container things. With Docker we create one container, but with Kubernetes we can manage multiple containers with something called as pods. Okay, so those are the two essential things you should be knowing in container system. That's about today's video, everyone. If you like the content, please subscribe to my channel. If you have any confusion, you can ask me in the comments. If you have any other opinion also, you can ask me in the comments. We can have a discussion, because whatever I'm giving, it's up to my knowledge, whatever I know. You can add something, and I'll be putting a timestamp in the description so that you can navigate between the section. But I will be coming with a new video every week. See you again. Have a good day.